They dragged him through the streets of Mecca, chained, beaten, silenced. The stone crushed his chest, but his lips whispered, "Hard, hard." One. He embraced Islam alone, no crowd, no speech, just a quiet shahada that changed the world. When the believers left Mecca, he walked with them. No belongings, no name, only faith. And in Medina, he rose. A slave once crushed, now calling the prayer, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. This isn't a story of chains. It's the story of freedom, real freedom, the kind that begins when you say, La ilaha illallah. Hard, hard. You're watching Qasas, religious stories. If your heart moved even once, subscribe now. With every story, a portion of this video's income goes directly to the poor and needy as sadaqah on your behalf. The story of Bilal begins. There was a man in Makkah. His name was Bilal. He was not rich. He was not Arab. He was not free. He was a slave, owned by a cruel man named Umayyah ibn Khalaf. Bilal was from Abyssinia. His skin was dark. He worked under the burning sun. He carried loads for others. He slept on the floor. He had no family to protect him, no tribe to stand up for him. In Makkah, he had no voice, no worth. People would pass by him like he didn't exist. But Allah saw him, and Allah chose him. One day, a message started spreading through Makkah. A man named Muhammad ibn Abdullah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was saying something no one had dared to say. Worship only one God, no idols, no partners, no lords besides Allah. The chiefs called him a liar. The people said he was crazy. They warned others not to listen. But Bilal listened. He stood at a distance, watching the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam walk the streets, speak to the poor, feed the hungry, care for the weak. And Bilal's heart started to move. He didn't need a long speech. He didn't argue. He didn't ask for a sign. He knew the truth when he saw it. And so, quietly, without anyone watching, Bilal said, La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah. No one else saw it. But in that moment, a slave became more honored than a king. When Umayyah ibn Khalaf found out that Bilal had accepted Islam, he was furious. He grabbed Bilal, tied his hands and feet, dragged him through the streets of Makkah, through dust, rocks, heat, and then took him out into the open desert. The sun was burning, the ground was boiling. They threw Bilal onto the sand, shirtless, bleeding, chained, then placed a massive stone on his chest. He stood over him and shouted, Say it! Say Lat and Uzza are your gods. But Bilal didn't scream, he didn't beg. He only said one word, Ahad, Ahad, one, one. The more they beat him, the more he said it. The more they cursed him, the more he whispered it. Even when he fainted and they poured water on him to wake him up, he still said it. He would rather die than lie. The torture didn't stop. Day after day, they dragged him into the heat. They beat him, cursed him, pressed the rock harder, but he still said, Ahad, Ahad. One man couldn't bear to watch anymore. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, radiyallahu anhu, a man of wealth and honor, passed by. He saw Bilal chained, crushed, and near death. He walked straight to Umayyah ibn Khalaf and said, How long will you keep doing this? Let him go. Umayyah, teasing, You want him? Then buy him. Abu Bakr didn't argue. He didn't bargain. He paid. And then he turned to Bilal, looked him in the eyes, and said, You are free now, Bilal. No crowd cheered, no trumpet blew, but that moment shook the earth. The most humiliated man in Makkah had just become one of the most honored in Islam. After he was freed, Bilal never left the Prophet. He followed him in the streets. He stood behind him in prayer. He sat beside him during the hardest days, the boycott, the insults, the threats. When the Prophet ﷺ was rejected, Bilal stood beside him. And when the Muslims made hijrah to Medina, Bilal was among the first to leave everything behind. In Medina, he helped build the masjid with his own hands. He fought beside the Prophet. The one who was once a slave was now family to the Prophet. The Prophet loved him, trusted him, chose him for special tasks. Bilal was no longer in the background. He was one of the faces of Islam. When they arrived in Medina, there was still one thing missing. How would people know it was time to pray? Some companions suggested using a bell. Others said a horn. But then, one companion saw a dream. In that dream, he heard the words of the Adhan. When the Prophet heard the dream, he said, "This is a true dream. Tell Bilal to say what you heard." And that's what happened. Bilal stood, faced the people, and raised his voice. "Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Ashhadu an la ilaha illa Allah." His voice filled Medina. Windows opened, doors swung, people ran from their homes. That same voice, the one that once cried Ahad Ahad, was now calling people to stand before Allah. He became the first muazzin in Islam. And the Prophet ﷺ said, "Bilal has a voice more beautiful than yours." Then came the day that broke every heart. The Prophet ﷺ passed away. The city fell silent. People couldn't speak. And Bilal, he couldn't even stand. He tried to give the adhan one last time. He climbed to his spot, and when he reached, choked up, "Ashhadu anna Muhammadar Rasulallah," he broke. He couldn't go on. And after that, Bilal never gave adhan again. Not in Medina, not anywhere. Every time he tried, his heart collapsed. Years passed. Bilal had left Medina. He lived quietly in Syria. But one night, he saw a dream. He saw the Prophet, ﷺ, smiling, looking at him, and he said, "O Bilal, why haven't you visited me?" Bilal woke up in tears. He packed his things and began traveling back to Medina. When he arrived, the companions begged him, "Please, give the adhan, just once." He said no, he couldn't do it. Then Hassan and Hussein, the grandsons of the Prophet ﷺ, came to him. They said, "Uncle Bilal, for us?" He looked at their faces, and he couldn't say no. He stood up, faced the city, and began, "Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar." The people froze, windows burst open. It felt like the Prophet ﷺ had returned, and everyone cried. Bilal returned to Syria. He lived humbly, spoke little, remembered Allah often. As he grew old, his body weakened. He became sick. One night, his wife sat beside him. She said, "What sorrow, O Bilal? What sorrow?" But Bilal opened his eyes and said, "No, what joy. Tomorrow I will meet Muhammad ﷺ and his companions." Those were his last words, and then he returned to Allah. The man who once lay beaten in the desert was now honored in every masjid on earth. The voice that once cried Ahad, Ahad, still echoes through every adhan, every day. And now, whenever you hear the adhan, remember that voice, remember that heart. Bilal had no money, no power, no tribe, just one thing.
La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah.
And with that, he shook the world. Bilal gave everything just to say, Ahad, Ahad. If that moved your heart, subscribe to Qasas Religious Stories, and with every view, your reward becomes sadaqah in his honor.